This week on the Communicators, Walt Mossberg, who writes a personal technology column in the Wall Street Journal that's geared toward the average technology user.
Well, regular tech watchers and viewers of this program will recognize the name Walt Mossberg of the Wall Street Journal, maybe not the face, but he is joining us this week on the Communicators. He writes the personal technology column in the Wall Street Journal, and he's also co-executive editor of allthingsd.com. Mr. Mossberg, when did you start writing your personal technology column?
Well, Peter, it was 1991, and you can call me Walt.
Well, I appreciate that. Do you remember what your first column was about in 1991?
The first line of my first column was, "Personal computers are just too hard to use, and it's not your fault." And the idea behind the column was there were a lot of computer columns at the time, or technology columns. And the contribution I made was to convince the editors of the Journal that we should write a column that, unlike nearly all the others, was not written by geeks for geeks, but was actually written to champion non-techie, smart people. They were smart about whatever their business was. Could be television, it could be that they were an insurance agent, it could be that they were a teacher, whatever it was. But they didn't know or really want to know how the computer or the digital camera or whatever it was worked. They just wanted to be able to use it. And in those days, and it's hard, I think, sometimes for viewers now to remember, it was really, you had to basically put in many, many, many hours and days and weeks to learn the intricacies of a personal computer. So my idea was to write this in English, champion those people, not the techies and enthusiasts, and instead of being reverential toward the industry, which a lot of the writers were in those days, I was given full leeway to be critical of the industry for not making these things easier for average non-techie people to use. So that was the idea.
So when's the last time you wrote about PCs?
Within the last few months. I mean, I review PCs, laptops, netbooks. I have a writing partner who works for me, Catherine Barrett, very bright woman who reviewed the new MacBook Pro last week. PCs, there are hundreds of millions of them, and they're sold in large numbers every year. I think they will be eventually, and when I say eventually, I mean probably not that long in the future, be outsold by tablets like your iPad here on the desk. But people are snapping up PCs every second that we're sitting here in this interview, and actually it's even more prevalent in some parts of the world outside the U.S. So I'm not done writing about PCs. And furthermore, there's a very valid, I think, theory that says that the iPad you have here and other tablets are PCs, just in a different form. You know, they obviously are radically different user interface and all of that, but I don't regard that as just a consumption device to watch movies on, although it's great for that. I think it's a productivity device as well, and big companies, which I don't particularly pay attention to, are buying these things in the tens of thousands. So,
Walt Mossberg, when it comes to technology, is there a big three? And I'm thinking of, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Apple.
There's a big five. In fact, Eric Schmidt, the executive chairman of Google, appeared at a conference that I run, and this allthingsd.com website, which I run with my partner Kara Swisher, also has what I think is the premier tech conference in the country, just called All Things Digital. We just had our 10th year of our conference. And Eric Schmidt spoke there last year, and he talked about the gang of 4 companies that are dominant now. he was tweaking Microsoft by not including them. So I'm going to say there are 5. And the 5 are Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. And what makes those the principal competitors is that they all own platforms on which other companies are building products and services. So they control these big ecosystems in which hardware exists and services and software and apps, and they're all also competing with each other, at least in certain ways. Not, you might say, well, Apple is a hardware company and Amazon mostly sells products and digital content, and Google is mostly search and advertising, and that's true, but they all are kind of in each other's business, and they sue each other regularly, and so that's the big battle right now between those 5, among those 5.
Well, when those 5 companies started, they have one thing in common, which is they didn't care much about Washington, D.C., and they
Right.
didn't have any kind of Washington presence. Now they all have a pretty prominent Washington presence, and growing.
Yeah, they not only didn't care much about Washington, they were pretty much determined to ignore the government, and I think it was sort of naive to some extent, but they were living in this world where they thought, hey, we're changing the world, we're innovating, we don't have any trouble raising money, we don't have any trouble attracting talent, and we can see right before our eyes that the whole world is actually changing because of the products we make. So unlike those old industries, oil, railroads, whatever, we don't need to deal with the government. I mean, obviously they had legal departments that were involved in making sure they complied with regulations and paid taxes and all that, but other than that, they weren't here. And the big wake-up call really was the Microsoft antitrust suit, which in the case of Microsoft, obviously forced them to pay a lot of attention, and then, in the ensuing period to really bulk up their lobbying. Even then, it was many years before Apple had more than a couple of people here in D.C. And now, as you point out, they all have significant offices here. In some cases, not only for the purpose of doing traditional lobbying and so forth, but they actually have a little tech work sometimes going on in the region here around D.C.
So when it comes to the lobbying and the regulatory agencies here in Washington and the tech companies, first of all, did the Microsoft antitrust suit, was it just because Microsoft got too big?
No, it wasn't just because Microsoft got too big. I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that it's not illegal to be a monopoly. It's just illegal to use your monopoly power in certain ways. And Microsoft was viewed by the Justice Department as kind of bullying or constraining the companies that made PCs and into certain things. And that's, of course, ancient history. There's an antitrust case involving Apple and some book publishers right now. There's a Google antitrust case under consideration. No case has been filed. So it's not the sheer size of these companies, I think, that sometimes attracts the attention of the government as the way that they interact with the economy, the way they interact with privacy, the way they interact with commerce, and they're big, and in the case of Apple, they're very big in a dollar sense, but they're also big in the sense of the impact they have on everyone's lives, and obviously that's going to attract the attention of regulators and enforcement agencies in the city. I will say that I've lived in Washington now for nearly 40 years, and I spent 20 years as a Washington correspondent and an editor here in our Washington bureau before turning to technology. And my observation is that the government in general was and still is way behind in its actual integration and use of technology on a day-to-day basis. I'll give you an example. The government is the last, or one of the last major holdouts of using the BlackBerry. And the BlackBerry is a historic and important and storied device, and you never want to rule out that a company, particularly in tech, will make a comeback. But today, if you have a choice of a device to carry around, the BlackBerry is a severely limited device compared to an iPhone or an Android phone. And yet, this is one of the few cities where you can walk around and see large numbers of BlackBerries today. You don't see it in New York, you don't see it in Chicago, you don't see it in LA, you don't see it in London, you don't see it in Latin America. I mean, basically, the world has moved on and Washington has not. And that's kind of a symbol. When I used to cover national security in the State Department, and this was 25 years ago, granted, the reporters on the Secretary of State's airplane, including me, had what was for the time much more advanced laptops than the Secretary of State's officials or the CIA people on the plane or the DOD people on the plane. I mean, we had the best technology, and our government did not for day-to-day use. And obviously things have improved a lot since 25 years ago, but at every stage as technology moves, the government is the most sort of laggard. And so I think that actually affects the understanding of these companies. I'm not saying that the government shouldn't be regulating them. And there was a view at one time in Silicon Valley that they were sort of immune to regulation. I don't believe that. But I do think that sometimes the government, Congress's understanding, or the White House's understanding is not where it should be.
Why is that?
Don't know. I think there's a cocoon here to some extent. Look,
is there a cocoon out in Silicon Valley?
I was about to say there's a cocoon in Silicon Valley too about thinking about the way average people operate or the governments of the world operate. They're getting educated fast in Silicon Valley about that. They do everything fast. And here in Washington, we do everything slow. So, there's a cocoon in New York about, I suppose, in parts of New York about, the financial industry, and they don't quite connect with how everyone else sees them or interacts with them. Every town that is an industry town has that, and Silicon Valley certainly does. But the Washington cocoon, one of the impacts of it, I think, has been to not allow at least the senior people. I think the junior people here are different. Staffers and people are much more attuned to normal use of technology, but really very few people at senior levels in the branches of government live a digital lifestyle compared to leaders of even corporations that are not in tech have learned to live a digital lifestyle. I was recently at a meeting with a company, the whole hierarchy of a company that is not a tech company. It's got dealings with tech companies, but it's not a tech company. And they've all switched to just using iPads. They all were sitting there with iPads in front of them. I mean, the CEO, the COO, the CFO, the chief marketing officer, all these people. They've adopted this quickly. In Hollywood, they've adopted it. You see iPhones and iPads and sometimes Android devices in the hands of even the top people. They read their scripts on iPads instead, and they've put away their laptops. Not so much here in Washington. So there is a gap.
Well, I did bring down my personal devices, and you can see here is a BlackBerry and an Android and an iPad. So how much of a dinosaur am I?
Well, the Android and the iPad are very modern. I don't know which Android phone this is.
A couple years old.
So it's a couple of years old. But, I would not say you're a dinosaur. at all. I don't know why you still have the BlackBerry. Why do you still have the BlackBerry?
Email, work email.
These other two devices do a great job with work email.
I've gotten really good with my thumbs on this thing.
Yeah. Well.
No? When did you give yours up?
Oh, I never had a BlackBerry as a daily device. I refused to use the ones they issued at the Journal. I used a Palm Trio, and then which did have it wasn't about physical keyboards. It was about the ability to use apps and to do all kinds of different cool things on the phone, and to be more productive, actually, because there are loads of apps that are productive. And the BlackBerry never had very many apps and still doesn't. So, and it also, to me, had a very complex user interface. It really was designed as a corporate device. There's loads of consumers who use them, and I don't mean to insult anyone. I could, and you could probably show me as well. Both of us could show videos and games and whatever you want to do on there, but it's a good email device. But it's a good email device mostly for corporate email, where the IT department has decided you should use it.
Well, Walt Mossberg, we asked some reporters here in Washington who covered tech policy if they had a question for you or anything, and Gautam Nagesh of CQ had one, and to talk about the iPad, but he said, how do you view Microsoft's new tablet computer, and can they compete in hardware?
Yeah, maybe we should explain to people that something historic happened in the last week, which is that Microsoft announced that it's building what I think is its first computer that it's ever built. It happens to be a tablet computer, but it's a computer. And it will run the new version of Windows, which is coming out in the fall, which is kind of a hybrid of a tablet operating system and the familiar Windows that we know. It's a big gamble. We don't know whether that will appeal to consumers, but they decided to essentially adopt Apple's model. Microsoft and Apple, of course, have been rivals for decades, and one of the big differences between them was that Microsoft was very, very firm on the idea that, putting aside for a minute the Xbox, which is a separate thing in the gaming market, their philosophy was, we will make the operating system, other people will make the hardware. Apple's philosophy right from the beginning has been, the right way to do this is to do the whole thing, so that the software integrates with the hardware. It's one reason, for instance, that I've tested, along with my reviewing colleagues, I don't know, 24 or 36 tablets, and not a single one has come within 2 hours of the battery life of the iPad. And it's not because Apple has a secret battery technology. It's partly because they own the operating system and they own the hardware, and they can make the operating system operate in a way under the covers that is friendly to battery life. Whereas a company like Samsung, as good a company as it is, and it is, has to take Android and kind of integrate it with their hardware, and the two things weren't made together. So, to go to the question, my first thing I would say is Microsoft it's a historic thing. They've capitulated to the Apple model. Now they're doing it to compete with Apple, but they tried it once before with a music player, but it was way too late, and it never took off. And now they're doing this. And the answer as to whether I think it can succeed is, I haven't reviewed it yet. I haven't lived with it. I'm a reviewer, like a movie reviewer or something, except I review technology things. And I have seen it. I've fooled around with it for 10 or 15 minutes. I know the people that were behind it and understand the whole explanation of why they did it and how they did it. But my judgment really is always reserved for when I've had a chance to use it for at least a couple of weeks. So it looks good, and we'll just have to see. One issue is that it depends what you mean by succeed. They're initially only going to sell it in limited outlets. The Microsoft has about 20 stores. They have an online store. It looks like, partly because of the politics of not wanting to, the delicacies of not wanting to compete with their own licensees like Dell and Lenovo and Acer, they're going to not distribute it as widely as they might.
Elizabeth Wasserman, who is the editor of Tech Pro at Politico, wants to know, will do not track features in web browsers solve the privacy problem, or are laws needed?
Laws are needed. Luckily, I'm an opinion columnist, not a news reporter at the Wall Street Journal and All Things D, and so I can have opinions, and it is my opinion that we need a serious, comprehensive federal level privacy law in the United States, digital privacy law. I do not believe that the online advertising industry and other online businesses have been or will be successful at regulating themselves. And it's no different than other experiences we've had over the long history of the United States. I don't mean to sound like I want to go crazy and, quote, regulate the internet. On the other hand, I don't believe the internet should exist as a place outside the law. And here's an example of one thing that might happen. Now, we know, I know before I say this, that the political climate in Congress is never, ever this simple. But you could have a bill which simply said, Peter, that your personal information, which the law would define, whatever it is, your name, your gender, your age, your income, your address, your phone number, your email, whatever 8, 10, 12 items they think of as your core personal information, that's your private property. And just say, and it should get treated like all other private property in the United States. We have a whole economy and a whole society built on private property. There are thousands of court cases and thousands of laws about the disposition and ownership of private property. If you simply defined your information as private property, then maybe somebody would actually have to ask you permission, not opt out, but opt in. Can we use your private property to fuel our business, which is doing analytics to deliver ads? Peter, can we use it? You could say no. Or maybe somebody would, this is a radical idea, but I'm being facetious because we are a capitalist society and I work for the Wall Street Journal. Why not pay you for it? Maybe your attitude is, under no circumstances can you use it. Maybe your attitude is, I really don't care, go ahead and use it. But maybe your attitude is, it's my private property. Pay me something. Give me a discount on your product, or give me $5, or give me $5 a week, or whatever it is. We could actually have a whole business built up around the use of this. Right now what happens is they simply take it, they being a whole collection of analytics companies and advertising companies and companies that depend on advertising like Google and Facebook, they take this information and the only thing you're given, supposedly, is targeted ads that you should enjoy more than non-targeted ads. And I don't know about you, but I've been on the internet every day since it started, and since it started the web started as a public thing, and I still don't get ads that are targeted at my interests. So I don't think they've held up their end of the bargain, and yes, I think we need a privacy law.
So what does RIM, Google, Apple know about me?
Well, Google, I don't know about RIM. I don't know what they're not that involved in social stuff. C-SPAN, if that's a C-SPAN issued phone, your IT department knows a certain amount about you because they and RIM together control the email system on there. Google knows a lot about you. They know a lot. If you use them, I don't know, maybe you don't use them, but if you use them for search, and since you have an Android phone, use presumably some of their other services, they know a lot about you. I'm not saying they use it, but we all do know that there are some cases. There's a recent case that's still going on with the street mapping where they were collecting stuff out of people's Wi-Fi networks. So they know a lot about you. Apple also knows a lot about you. Apple has had a few slip-ups, but by and large, Apple's been much more conservative about your privacy, much to the consternation of, for instance, of magazine publishers and others. Apple has not been willing to give them even your basic information unless you allow it, and that has annoyed a lot of the magazine publishers. So Apple is more restricted, but they just brag that they have 400 million customers whose credit cards they have. I don't mean that they stole the credit cards. I mean, when you signed up as a customer at iTunes, entered a credit card just as you have presumably done at Amazon or other places. So they know a certain amount about you too.
Walt Mossberg, in the past, we've talked about companies such as AOL, Dell, and now we're talking about Apple and Microsoft. Is one of the big five going to be a dinosaur in 10 years?
Oh, it's certainly possible. Look, Apple was 90 days from bankruptcy 15, 16 years ago. 90 days after being the wunderkind 10 years earlier. So, and that now they're probably the single most influential tech company and one of the most influential companies in the world, and they're highly profitable and their market capitalization is enormous. Google didn't exist, 30 years ago when the digital revolution got going. Yeah, any one of these guys can fail. And one of the things that I love, actually, about covering the tech sector is people do fail, and it's not a stigma. If you fail, you can dust yourself off and come back and try to get funding, and often you can get funding if you come up with another good idea. And there's always a second chance. I mean, there's a lot of sectors of our society where failure really is a big stigma, and tech is not one of them. But the answer is any of these people can. Look, it's very interesting. Microsoft you haven't heard much about Microsoft in the last 5-6 years. They've been kind of behind the curve on phones and tablets, and they still are. But this is going to be a year where there's a lot of Microsoft excitement, and I think that's a great strength of the tech sector. Companies are up, companies are down, new companies form, other companies go out of business. It's really the free market and innovation and entrepreneurship at its best in our economy.
Walt Mossberg, what's a piece of technology or an arc that's coming that you see that you're excited about?
Well, it's an overused term, but I think the cloud is an enormous thing. And what the cloud simply means is beginning to rely more on remote services on servers somewhere in the world that you get to through a relatively thin light device. I mean, there were may I touch this? There were, in the early 80s, there were theories and papers written about having something thin and little like this that could nevertheless do all kinds of amazing things. Partly this can do that because processors have gotten better and batteries have gotten thinner and screens and all that stuff, but partly it's because we have Wi-Fi and we have cellular data now that moves at pretty fast rates. And there are apps on here that are purely local. I don't know what apps you have on yours, but you could go download apps that store everything on here. It could be a game, it could be a reference app. There's a great app about the periodic table if you're into science or you're a student of science. That's all local on here, mostly local, not entirely. But a lot of apps on here, which give you restaurant recommendations or travel stuff or whatever it is, Wikipedia, whatever. There are probably 25 Wikipedia apps on here. those things go out into the cloud and get the data. So this thing does not have to have a huge hard disk in it. And I think the cloud, it has issues, there's insecurities, there's multiple different cloud services, and you have to kind of figure out what you want to do. But that is an enormous thing.
And all these devices use Spectrum.
Well, everything uses Spectrum, but I think that's a real Washington way of looking at it. Actually, the tech guys are beginning to think that they can figure out a way to slice the spectrum in a way that would actually open it up. I'm not saying the telecom companies have this point of view, but the tech guys are working very hard on ways they think to split it up. But yeah, they all use Spectrum. Wi-Fi, as you know, is an unregulated piece of the spectrum, and you'll notice that it has taken off phenomenally. But yeah, to get to the internet, you have to have a way to connect. You're absolutely right.
Do you see a difference in spectrum policy coming in the next couple of years?
Spectrum policy...
and again, a Washington question.
Yeah, it's a Washington question. There's two things about spectrum policy that I would note. One is it's based on very old concepts. I mean, look, the physics are the physics. There's only so much spectrum. We get that. I'm not disputing that. But the way the government divvied it up stems from radio, stems from a very old thing. The notion that things would, if the spectrum was too close to each other, it would interfere. And there's just a million policies at the FCC that really have their roots in an era that bears no resemblance to the era today. That's one thing. Secondly, spectrum policy in Washington is enormously, even more than some other policies, influenced by lobbying. The FCC universe is full of, people leave the FCC and they become telecommunications lawyers practicing before the FCC. Presidents of both parties appoint people with, I'm not saying any of this is illegal or corrupt, but it's just the truth. It's another one of these bubbles. There's a telecom bubble around the FCC. One of the reasons why some of the traditional telecom interests aren't that high on the current FCC chairman, Julius Genachowski, is that he doesn't have a telecom background. He has much more of a tech outlook on the world. He's close to the president personally, which is an advantage for him. But and he's a very smart guy. We've had him at our conference. He gets all of these tech data device issues, but the traditional deep-rooted telecom interests here in this town, he's not their favorite guy. He doesn't come out of their world. So I think spectrum policy needs a tremendous overhaul, and it needs to be focused overwhelmingly on digital, wireless lifestyles that people are adopting, not on old broadcast lifestyles.
And one final question then from Eliza Krigman of Politico, a reporter who covers technology. Will AT&T and Verizon's dominance, is that going to slow down innovation in the tech space? And we'll leave it there.
I think the answer to that is that it well could. And this is not a particular criticism of those two companies. I believe that one of the big game-changing differences that was kicked off by the iPhone was that it was the first significant phone in the United States. There may be some other one that I don't know about, but it might have been the first period, where the carrier, in that case it was AT&T, it was actually Singular, which changed its name to AT&T right around that time, did not have anything to say about the phone. And the same is true today, whether it's Verizon, Sprint, or AT&T, or any of the ones overseas. Apple controls that phone. It's like a PC, or a Mac. They basically, let's say you have a Dell in your house, and you decide to switch it for an HP. Or let's say you're using Chrome browser, but you decide to switch to, Safari. You don't have the company from which you buy your internet connection, whether it's Comcast or whoever it is, FiOS, whoever it is here in Washington. You have to let them know anything about that. It's not their business. They're not involved in what computer you have. They didn't help design that computer. You didn't buy it from them. They don't get to say what browser's on it. None of that stuff. And Apple's approach with the iPhone was much more like the Mac or a PC approach than the traditional phone approach, which was the carriers decided what phones you could use on their network. Carriers dictated to the phone makers how the phone should look, what the software should be on the phone, all of that stuff. Carriers have had colossal power. And AT&T and Verizon, and what we've had is a concentration of wireless carriers, as the questioner mentioned, with AT&T and Verizon roughly the same size, being so much bigger than Sprint and T-Mobile. And the thing that I worry the most about when we're talking about innovation is that AT&T and Verizon are now, first of all, they're bringing out, particularly Verizon, a wonderful thing, which is called LTE, which is the only real, quote, 4G. Your viewers can ignore almost all the other 4G ads unless they say LTE. AT&T is also rolling it out. It's very fast. It's faster than most people's home wired internet connections by orders of magnitude. It could be 4 times as fast as your home internet. But they're putting it into these buckets. They're charging you a lot of money if you go over a certain number of gigabytes or megabytes a month. No one knows how to count megabytes and gigabytes. They're now providing apps and notifications when you get close to your limits, and they think that that's the solution. But companies that are coming out with great new things for any of these devices are assuming and depending upon the fact that you can, if you choose, you can go and subscribe. Let's say Netflix, you can subscribe to that, and you can watch movies all day on here. Well, the new metered pricing, championed primarily by AT&T and Verizon, I think, is going to have a stifling effect on the kinds of things you can do on these devices and through the cloud and over the network. And I worry about that. I imagine one response might be that these devices, technologies are invented that somehow are much more efficient in the use of this, but I don't know.
Walt Mossberg, Wall Street Journal personal technology columnist and co-executive editor of allthingsd.com at the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for being on the Communicator.
Well, thank you for having me.